Think tanks have become hotbeds of influence on both the right and left, with many policy experts calling them home. But these think tanks rely heavily on outside funding to keep their scholars, fellows, and researchers refining their expertise. Who funds them?
According to Cleveland-Stout, over a third of all think tanks, especially those focused on foreign policy, like the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and American Enterprise Institute, are entirely opaque, meaning they do not disclose where their funding comes from. He's developed the Think Tank Funding Tracker, which is a repository keeping tabs where top US think tanks get their money. That can include the American and foreign governments, as well as Pentagon contractors. He's been tracking where this money comes and goes since 2019.
Here to shed light on think tank funding is Nick Cleveland-Stout, a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Thanks for joining us on Rising.
Hey, great to be here.
So what do you think are the consequences for policy of these think tanks being able to not disclose where they're getting funding, and what I presume in some cases are them getting funding from governments or quasi-governmental organizations?
It's sort of the great unknown, right? Like, we don't know who the donors behind a lot of these dark money think tanks are, and that should concern more people. Like, these are the think tanks that are testifying to Congress, that are frequently quoted in media. American Enterprise Institute, Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Washington Institute for Near East Policy, just to name a few of some of the most prominent. But I think instead of sort of being ostracized, like, these think tanks are invited to testify and into these kind of prestigious circles, and that's concerning, because what we know is that funding matters. It can play a role in the end products of what think tanks do. We know in some cases, like, it can obviously lead to self-censorship, but in some cases it can even lead to outright censorship. And I think first and foremost, we need to get to the bottom of who is funding these think tanks.
And is there any way at all of finding that out? I mean, I know we noted in the introduction that a lot of these think tanks are entirely opaque, but is there any even circuitous route to finding out at least some level of what their funding sources are?
As of right now, we sort of have to rely on investigative journalism, or even think tanks themselves sort of accidentally letting slip. American Enterprise Institute accidentally mentioned at an event a couple of years ago that they're funded by Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin. In theory, there's one rule that's kind of on the books that could shed some light, and that's the Truth and Testimony Rule in Congress. It basically is a form that asks think tanks to, think tank experts to, when they're testifying to Congress, to disclose certain information. Are you funded by foreign governments? If so, which ones? Sort of common sense questions like that lawmakers should at least have some information about when they're considering whether to take someone's advice into account. However, at the top of that form, it asks the question, are you testifying in a personal capacity or an institutional capacity? And the way that it's interpreted right now is a lot of experts will say, oh, I'm just testifying in an individual capacity. And so that sort of divorces them from the institution, as if that were even really possible, because, this is like who you're relying on to put food on the table.
You work for the Quincy Institute. We have a lot of experts from the Quincy Institute on this show to talk about foreign policy. Both Niall and I are largely fans of a more non-interventionist approach to foreign policy that is often represented by the Quincy Institute. I saw in some of your commentary on this issue the kind of I guess reflexively interventionist or pro-war bent of a lot of DC-based policy think tanks that are able to keep their supporters secret, which I should say, by the way, I guess I support. First Amendment private organizations, I would support their right to keep private or keep secret who is supporting them, to keep that anonymous, even if I disagree with them. But is there something in that lends itself to, I guess, being unable for the public to criticize people who are advising time and time again interventions that are not popular among the American people?
Absolutely. I think it is a large factor in what militarizes our foreign policy. Not only do you have foreign governments that are interested in increasing, expanding the U.S. security architecture so that they're under our umbrella, But you also have defense companies that it sort of dovetails with the interests of these defense company donors that also, get a windfall if, we give a security guarantee to Saudi Arabia, for example, or, invade Iraq. Like that was an idea that was sort of cooped up in a think tank as well, the Project for a New American Century. So kind of down the line, a lot of um, this militarized foreign policy, it oftentimes originates or is propagated or platformed by think tanks that their donors do benefit from a lot of these policies, and so that's the kind of conflict of interest that we want to call out, and we build out this database, which I encourage folks to check out, thinktankfundertracker.org. We want good faith journalists to be able to do a better job, essentially, of calling balls and strikes and disclosing those sorts of conflicts of interest.
To that point, Nick, I don't genuinely ask this question in any kind of gotcha way, but I imagine people watching will wonder, does the Quincy Institute publicize its donors?
We do, yes. That is an important question. We do publicize our donors, and the same way we're saying we should call balls and strikes. We see them. We encourage folks to come to our website and do the same. We have all of our donors. We have all kinds of donors listed there, and folks can take issue with whatever they want. But the point is that all of that's public. That's step one, is getting that information out there.
One thing we've covered a lot on Rising is threats to freedom of expression, censorship of social media being recommended by this network of ill-defined, very confusing, quasi-governmental, nonprofit organizations, some of them foreign. And then I find out time and time again, oh, and by the way, the State Department supports them. Or like the State Department is supporting an organization that is trying to extort social media platforms into taking down the speech of people who oppose war and other things. Is that another? Can you speak to fears of government funding some of these organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, U.S. government funding of think tanks, that was sort of the original model. Like the rise of federally funded research and development centers. That's sort of what gave rise to think tanks in the first place throughout the 50s and 60s, kind of the height of technocracy. In the 70s and 80s, you see it switch more towards special interests, foreign governments, corporations, defense companies, but federal funding still persists, and it largely persists to create a certain degree of independence from the U.S. government. It's a lot easier for the Department of Defense, for instance, which is the largest agency funder of these think tanks, to cite a study that originates outside of the government, at a place like RAND or the Atlantic Council, than if it were an internal study. It's just easier to cite. It creates that distance, a layer of bureaucracy to a degree. And another thing I'll say on that is that, if the U.S. if we are using taxpayer dollars to fund a lot of these think tanks, I think that a lot of taxpayers might want to know who else is funding that think tank. And so, if a think tank is hiding these sources, but still receiving that benefit from the U.S. government, not only in the form of funding, but also tax breaks, these are 501c3s, we should know about that.
Nick Cleveland-Stout of the Quincy Institute, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.